On this sunny day, welcome to Property Quorum. Well, if you've heard the theme music, you know we're gathered here to knock around and talk about what the hell's going on the property market. I know Hamish has got a few choice words to talk about, but before we get there, let me introduce you all, if you haven't seen them before. Juliet Babulal of Gunnar Cook, acclaimed property lawyer, Chris Gilson and Root Home, an acclaimed property developer of HMOs, and Hamish Clay of Search Convey, a search specialist, and our Lord and Master here. And of course, as is normal, I'm throwing Hamish mercilessly under the bus. What's today's topic, Hamish?
Well, the topic itself is brought about as a consequence of an announcement. Not that these things are necessarily a good idea, because commentary that we actually sort of see within the press can very often just be generated. Oh, we'll speak about this particular one, but our particular title is From Approval to Stalemate, the build-out trap. Now, we spoke last week about certain holds up within what the challenges were that could face pretty straightforward planning permissions and why they were held up from time to time, and what the government were wanting to do in order to speed up the build quantity. I mean, in fairness to the government, they did pretty darn well in the first 12 months. I mean, we forget about this. In the first 12 months, they were only 65,000 properties short in terms of the 300,000 that they wanted to actually sort of get out. So, mind you bear in mind there was an awful lot of stuff coming forward because houses don't get built in 5 minutes. It's a 5-year plan or it's a 4-year plan. It's not.
Some of them seem to have been built in 5 minutes, but that's another story.
However, what it was going to be suggested, there were a number of developers who were purposely holding up parts of their project, parts of their development, and therefore the government felt that they would put in regulation to see if the build out wasn't as effective as it should have been according to what the original planning strategy was, they would be imposing fines upon that particular sort of developer as an incentive to encourage them to actually do things. But I'm not so sure that that's the best answer, although it might be an incentive in some respects.
Juliet, welcome to the show as ever. Isn't this a bit like putting a sticking plaster on a gaping wound?
Yeah, I mean, who are they trying to help with, with this fine, for example? Are they trying to help themselves, or are they trying to get the developers to comply with certain conditions? That, I just think this sort of penal attitude that we currently have, where you don't do something, you're going to be penalized for it, without actually realizing what the issue might be. We spoke about potential things that can happen that can cause a development to be delayed, and to treat developments with a broad brush approach to say, look, if you haven't done it in this time, we're going to apply this draconian system where we're going to fine you, and not actually look behind the reason for the delay, is a little bit third world, if I'm honest with you. And I'm just kind of thinking, who are they trying to help? If the ultimate aim is to get a certain amount of houses on the market, then surely there should be systems in place to assist these developers who are struggling. I'm not talking about the big time developers, but a developer who's, not aware of exactly what they're doing. They may be just, maybe the newbie developer kind of thing. But why should they be penalized? Or why should they be part of a system where there's a penalty for not complying with a condition, without the body that's going to penalize them actually looking into the issue in the first hand and actually helping people? I just think this sort of system about, it's like getting a car fine where you've got a fine in the post and you think, well, I haven't even done that, but they've got a camera and it's telling me I've committed this crime, so I have to pay this penalty. And you pay the penalty because you haven't got the time to fight it, or to me that is just really backward. And, you know, when you look at a development or you look at a planning permission, what you see on paper isn't actually what translates in reality. And the policymakers and the people making these decisions, ask them how many developments they've actually been involved in and if they actually understand the know-how of developments. They haven't. So you've got policymakers who don't understand the development system or the way that planning actually works. But for them, it's easy to say we're actually doing something. We're putting in fines in place to ensure that these developers do what they're supposed to do. I find the pressure on developers really unfair, because they're at this point now where they might even have the budget to comply with the development conditions. They now have the looming thought of a fine or a penalty, on their minds. It doesn't help anyone.
Chris, I'm just worried that they're going to get notes through their post saying building fine, and they think it's a positive comment on their building capabilities. Right. So, anyway, moving on. Do you think that applying fines in this way, these fines, unless they're properly punitive, will have little or no effect anyway? What is their point?
It depends who they're fining. If it's an SME, then there's going to be a potentially disastrous impact on their bottom line. If it's a big PLC, they probably won't care. Ultimately, they're going to pass on those costs onto the consumer, their customers. So that's really the problem.
So the only people who are going to suffer through this at the end point will be the customer, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it'll either be increased costs or less competition. So still increased costs because supply will be tightened. So yeah, it's a lose-lose. And really
but then this conspiracy theorist deep within me suddenly says, is this a money-making exercise for the government?
I'm not sure it's a money-making exercise. I just think it's not very well thought through. Since they control the money supply, I don't think they really need to add additional taxes in.
No, they can just print a load more.
Yeah, which they will do. It's just not particularly well thought through. Like Juliet's mentioned, it's policymakers making decisions that they've just got their heads in the clouds, and they've got no attachment to reality of how business operates, of all the other constraints that are in the planning system and that developers have to comply with. The margins are tight enough at the moment, so shrinking them even further by adding additional costs into the process, obviously for a smaller developer, and any business passes on its costs onto the customer. It will absorb what it can, and it passes on the costs. So development is no different, but some of the margins are so tight that yes, the big developers they have economies of scale, so they can spread the load. Smaller businesses can't. They may be doing one or two schemes on an annual basis. So if the margins get reduced to a point where they're at risk of going bump, then that's just another small developer that's lost. And unfortunately, then it just leads to this amalgamation of these bigger organizations that does restrict the supply, that does limit the availability of different options for people, which it's not in anyone's interest, really.
Hamish, it seems to me a fit of craziness that somebody's had a bright idea, some bright spark in the government's had an idea, and they've reached for the fine draw. Oh, let's use one of them. That's sure to knock them back into line.
Well, the thing is, it's a bit of a toughie in a way. I do feel that if we give people incentives rather than sort of try and rebuff people for not performing the way we expect, because I think really Juliet put the whole thing in perspective. There are many people who are suggesting this is a good way to do things who don't actually understand fully what is going on. I mean, a tremendous example, and this is full of so many connotations. Locally, sort of here in Bicester, it was deemed because there were decisions made behind closed doors to turn a roundabout into a squareabout. If that makes sense, instead of a roundabout lights and sort of all the rest of it, because over the next 5 years there should be 900 new sort of eco-friendly homes built, and people will either want to walk or cycle using this particular roundabout to get across it. Now, during that in itself was bad enough because the price went up from 10 million to 12 million just to accommodate this. But what actually happened partway through it this whole thing was taking 18 months. Now they ran out of materials. They closed off a major road, an arterial road through Vista, and it was meant to be closed for 4 weeks, which is bad enough in itself. But they had to need to do double that length of time because they ran out of materials. Now this is what developers will do. And basically, when the planning goes through for a large development, it will be based on certain materials that are actually required. And all of a sudden, there's a shortage of supply. There's nothing that developer, there's nothing that builder can do. And as Chris was actually saying, if that's a small company, they are held up. They're fiercely held up. Because remember, these poor guys, they're paying out money. They're having to pay off bridging loans and all sorts of things to accommodate what's actually sort of moving forward. They're not going to hold it up purposely. In many instances, there will be. Or if they are holding it up, there will be good reason because it's going to make a killing on it. So the odd fine here and there isn't going to make much of a difference. So in a way, it might be better to turn around, like on those roadworks, if they'd said instead of taking 18 months, you can do it in 15 months, we'll pay you an incentive. We'll bung you an extra sort of 10 grand or whatever. That would make much more of a difference. That would give the incentive to keep things on the move and would give the cash flow back to the developer that's being held up, because we know pricing of materials is a big thing.
Juliet, do you agree with Hamish that it should be more carrot and perhaps a little bit less stick?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you've got to look at the psychology of this. I mean, you're dealing with people at the end of the day. And if you're setting fines just to be seen to be doing something, but the outcome is being passed on to the consumer, how can that be good for anyone? But if you're offering incentives, if you're saying to me, look, if I deliver this development to you within, before the actual completion date, you're going to give me some sort of relief on my SIL payment or my Section 106 payment or whatever it is, then I've got that incentive to push forward. If you've got developers, and to be honest, you've got conditions within planning permissions that says, look, you've got to commence within a 3-year period. So otherwise the planning lapses. That in itself is a penalty, because the reality is you've got to repay to get the thing, reignited, so to speak. So if you are a developer, you've got the benefit of planning and you haven't done anything, then surely you don't need an additional penalty on top of that. So to get the human psyche to work, in my opinion, whoever's controlling these sites, if you give them these incentives, then they are likely to, move, heaven and earth to get things done. And that is a more positive sort of, a solution than just willy-nilly throwing out fines there. Because the penal system, to me, it's like, again, I go back to it being a broad brush approach. You can't, if you've got a developer who's struggling with finances, can't get development finance, can't find the workforce, etc., and you're adding on a penalty, what is that going to do? It's going to dissuade this person from ever venturing into the development world. So to me, that is absolutely pointless. If you're saying on the one hand, we want to increase the labor in the UK, we want to increase the houses, etc., just putting a fine on people is not the answer. So I have to say, yes, I holistically agree that there are certain reliefs that can be given, and sort of given within a methodology. It's not just, again, given willy-nilly, but it incentivizes people to perform. And that is how the human psychology works. So, I agree. I think that is a great solution.
Chris, do you think that this kind of stick approach is actually going to, as Juliet espouses, going to effectively potentially reduce the marketplace by sucking away landlords? And because what's the point if you fall foul of any of this? You could suddenly be in stuck.
It happens at every turn, yeah. And every time they do use that increasing regulation, increasing punitive measures, people step away. It's just disincentivizes people to work with the company called the government, because people just don't want to. Why would you want to be ear-bashed and have all these fines and all these other things applied to you when you don't have to do that? You could just step away from it and go and do something else. So yeah, it disincentivizes and disenfranchises a whole section of different industries completely unnecessarily.
It does seem to be an imposition that doesn't need to be there. Spencer Collin has said that in the context of recent welfare reforms, to what extent does housing provision for disabled households adequately address the challenges posed by penalties in property, and how effectively do policymakers prioritise and mitigate these issues? I'd like to ask that question to you, Juliet.
Well, that's the exact point that we're making. The policymakers haven't got a clue as to what, the decisions that they're making and the overall outcome. And you're right, you've got to look at society as a whole. It's not just, oh my gosh, I've got a rich developer here and I'm going to fine them. It's about affordability throughout. And unless you've got policymakers who are themselves getting their hands in the mix, you've got the policies in the wrong hands, quite frankly. So it's paper pushers making decisions that don't actually see what the actual outcome or the actual effect on the end product is. So that is exactly the point that we've been making throughout.
Yes, Chris, would you add to that before I pass to Hamish just to wind the show up?
I think that the policymakers need to be brought in after having some sort of experience in the fields that they're trying to set policy in. I think that's pivotal. I think I'm not sure who these guys are at the moment, but they just seem like theoretical people, maybe stuck in a basement somewhere, never seen the light of day, and certainly never getting their hands dirty. That's not the way to do things.
No, probably not. I mean, I've always said if you want to find out how a client feels, just walk a mile in their shoes. That way you're 1 mile away from them and you've got their shoes. Hamish, would you care to just bring this show to a graceful close?
I would certainly appreciate that myself, if I was asked to carry out a task, if somebody turned around to me and said, I tell you what, if you can do it quicker, we will pay you more than you actually requested from us.
Yeah,
and that would give me some kind of incentive. And I've always tried. One of the things I do try to do is to sort of speed up what we can do in terms of our background, in terms of the searches we provide, and if we can actually sort of do that, that is part, because we try to provide a service actually sort of doing that. And the same with these developers. They have planned to succeed. They haven't planned to fail in any way at all. They plan to succeed. And they've planned with all of the parameters which they have at their disposal at the time of the planning. And if all of a sudden there's a shortage of this, there's a shortage of that, what have you, it's going to mess up their finances anyway. So by actually putting an additional burden on them, it really is, and it's just really going to put people off. We want to encourage people to actually invest. If somebody's thinking, well, hang on, if this project goes haywire and it's taking me long and it's going to cost me, say, an extra 750 grand in fines or whatever it's going to cost, am I really going to bother with it? Or perhaps I'll just sort of hang on and just make sure everything's right, or perhaps I won't even bother. They want people on their side. And I think it's not the best way to get people on your side. There's a tremendous incentive to get properties built. And if we want to get them built, it's the carrot. It's the carrot that's going to make the difference.
It does seem to me that the consensus is more carrot, less stick, and also, who knew? Maybe they should walk a mile in the shoes of the developers before they start making assignations and casting aspersions over the process and throwing fines out there that could potentially derail the entire process. It just remains for me to thank Juliet Babula of Gunner Cook, and of course Chris Gilson of Root Home, and our dear Lord and Master Hamish McClay of Search and Convey. And to all you out there, thank you, Spencer, for your comments. If you've got further comments like Spencer, please don't hesitate to make them during the show. We will address them directly. And until next week, please try and keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and try to look after that mental health. Until next week, bye-bye now.